We live in the most abundant time in human history, yet we have a shortage of leadership practiced in thinking about the future, including the ability to act quickly to transform local ingenuity into Earth-sized solutions. Never before has the need for thinking and acting differently been so evident and so urgent. Welcome to Leaders Expedition, LEX, a worldwide community serving as a catalyst to help future-focused leader makers transform the world one city, one issue at a time. These LEX conversations are an invitation for you to join some of the world's foremost thought leaders tackling some of the world's thorniest issues from a number of different perspectives. From sustainability to learning and education, healthcare to arts and culture, these conversations will inspire, energize, and lead all of us into a new commitment to act. My guest today on the podcast, Peter Biro, and like many other guests, it's really difficult to pinpoint exactly how to describe him. But I can tell you that Peter is a passionate and very fierce advocate for human rights, resistance against unaccountable governments, corporate influence, and technology. He's the founder of Section 1, an initiative calling all Canadians to a type of heroic citizenship in the face of some pretty serious threats to constitutional democracy, here and around the world. In this conversation, we use Peter's soon-to-be-released book, Constitutional Democracy Under Stress, A Time for Heroic Citizenship, as a way into a richer conversation about leadership, citizenship, and what it means in our current age. Peter, welcome to LEX Conversations.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
You know, many, including yourself, have referred to this current time we're in as kind of a perfect storm. And even over the past few weeks, COVID pandemic shutdown and crisis notwithstanding, we have racial tensions in the States spilling over the border and around the world. There's a lot of stress in the world. And I'm wondering, how are you looking out onto the world these days? What lenses are you bringing to help you make sense of things that might help us make sense of what's going on?
Well, I'm no different from most people. I live in a state of, bewilderment, concern, fear, anxiety, just like any human being that sees a kind of reordering occurring without any sense of exactly what the future order might look like. But at the same time, there are things to be encouraged about in this moment of upheaval and transformation. And I think one of the things that we know from history is that crisis and upheaval doesn't just mean disruption and a kind of detrimental impact on the way things are and on the interests such as they are vested in society, but they also crisis and upheaval, also bring about opportunity. It's in the great moments of crisis and upheaval and disruption that we see the emergence of new movements, of new conceptions of how society ought to be arranged. So I think it's a very important time to pay attention to where we've been, what we're coming out of, but not only to lament sort of the losses and all of this sort of collateral damage, whether it's from the pandemic or the economic reordering, if you will, and the undoing of globalism as we've understood it for the last half century at least. There's also an opportunity here to reshape the world, and there is some reason for hope, as my friend Jane Goodall likes to frame it. There is some reason for hope, and you see that in the resilience and the indomitable spirit, particularly of young people around the world. Rising up, sensing that there is something wrong, not always able to articulate precisely what that is, but having a kind of collective, this sort of intuitive sense that there's something profoundly wrong that needs to be corrected. And that's the moment that we're in right now.
Could we talk a little bit about intentionality? Because, there'd be some that would say all of this change that's coming, that's bound to come, comes naturally, almost as part of an evolutionary process. And I'm wondering, as active citizens, as active human beings in the world, what role does dogged intentionality play in all of this?
That is such a fabulous question, and it gets to some very complex issues that are as relevant in times of calm and stability as they are in moments of turbulence like this. Before getting to the question of the role of intentionality in this particular moment, I would say, generally speaking, the question of intentionality is critical in democratic society. And what I would say is we don't see enough of it. And when there are moments of tranquility and of calm and apparent stability, people essentially go about their business as citizens, as private citizens, as market people, as consumers, as members of the community. They simply, operate within an established framework and according to an established set of assumptions. What we do see, though, is that all of the exciting work during those moments, all of the exciting work in democracies occurs precisely in what I call intentional communities. So I love your choice of word. And intentional communities are those communities where people choose to participate, choose to belong, choose to engage, whether they be religious organizations or environmental organizations, NGOs, charitable purpose organizations, community organizations of every kind, whether they are organized around a set of intellectual shared concerns or a set of political objectives or passions or spiritual community of some kind. Intention is critical to progress at all times. Now, at this particular moment, and one of the things I'd say about times of stability and tranquility is that governments, the people's representatives, the political masters, during those periods don't pay sufficient attention to what's going on in intentional communities. And I say that it's in the intentional communities that, that's really where the repository of expertise on just about every subject matter resides. Now, in times like the one we're living in right now, intentionality it's an interesting question you pose, because it's difficult to know precisely whether there is intention with respect to mapping out some kind of, future trajectory of how society is going to reorder itself. Whether, in very specific terms, for example, police reforms. I mean, the last few days, literally, we're hearing a term that we'd never heard of before, defunding the police. Everyone's now suddenly talking about defunding the police. A very, very specific policy reform, very particular policy reform. And suddenly it's on everyone's lips. So, but the question is, does that mean that there's any kind of intentionality going on? Or has that become something of a mantra or a symbolic kind of reform that represents a broader set of concerns and values? Intentionality in terms of formulating policy or charting a particular course or taking a particular action is very different than I think the kind of motivation that leads to the groundswell of popular support for a broad movement or protest in the streets, not just in Minnesota, not just in around North America, but now in streets around the world. Not confined, mind you, not confined only to Western societies. We're seeing this all over the world. Is that about intentionality, or is that about some basic intuitive sense that we as human beings have that justice requires something different than what we've been experiencing communally?
Well, right out of the starting gate, your passion, Peter, is palpable, and I love it. And you mentioned expertise, and we live in a time where sometimes that expertise is questioned, ignored. And I'm thinking, in listening to you, that intentionality also requires a grounding in a way of thinking, in a way of accepting knowledge and in fact seeking knowledge, if not truth. So I'm wondering what your thinking is around the idea that we talk a lot about data, we talk a lot about information. Are we talking enough about knowledge and wisdom?
Oh, so you've hit one of the big nails on the head with your question again. I have a feeling I'm going to enjoy this conversation a great deal. I mean, and in fact, that question also kind of, in a way, underscores the nature of the distinction I was trying to make between the broad motivations that lead to, popular uprisings versus the very focused policymaking, reform-oriented objectives, and the question of knowledge and expertise and grounding in a tradition, both an intellectual tradition, a moral tradition, and of course, more precisely, a basic understanding of the subject matter in issue, right, around a particular reform or set of reforms. It's absolutely critical. One of the things I talk about briefly in my book is this concept of what's been called a shared epistemic foundation as being absolutely fundamental to any kind of viable liberal democracy in particular. The idea that there has to be this shared respect for and deference to the authority of knowledge, of facts, and of truth. Provisional, by the way, provisional as these concepts may be. In other words, there's a huge difference between deferring to a particular authority blindly and uncritically versus deferring to the idea in principle, in general, that there is something called objective knowledge, that there is some kind of fundamental truth, even if we can't necessarily grasp it. But the commitment to the idea of truth is absolutely vital for us to be able to develop any kind of consensus in society as to what is to be done. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? How will we justify it? You can't have consensus that's not founded on some shared epistemic foundation. Now, there's different kinds of consensus. I mean, you could have a consensus that is based on a set of myths or outright lies. You could have that. But then you have an obvious problem that flows from that. And that is, first and foremost, of course, that if the consensus is around a set of and by the way, there's a great and very valid role for myth in politics. But there's a difference between, myth and fraud. Okay, it's a huge difference. And ultimately, if you are going to try to build a politics on a consensus that is founded on lies, ultimately, first of all, your policies won't work. Whatever those policies may be, whether it's, how you fight a pandemic, how you develop antitrust policy to avoid the evils of large technology monopolies. It doesn't matter what the subject matter is. If the commitment to truth and to truth seeking isn't at the core of the sort of the value system, it's going to lead to catastrophe at the end of the day. And the only kind of governments that last and societies, these sort of polities that kind of exist, against that kind of backdrop, all right, are autocracies and dictatorships and despotisms. I mean, they're not tyrannies because democracies can't function on that basis.
So I'm going to jump in there, Peter, and you referred to your book, and I want to place this fascinating conversation in the context of that work that you began actually before the pandemic struck. The book is called Constitutional Democracy Under Stress, and it's a collection of very well thought out and very different writers writing on a particular topic under that theme. Could you tell us about, I guess, the evolution of how that book actually came about? Because that in itself is a fascinating story.
Oh yes, thank you, and thank you for mentioning it. But you didn't mention the subtitle of the book, which is called.
Oh no, I was saving that.
Oh, that's okay. So and the subtitle is an important part of the answer to your question. It's called "A Time for Heroic Citizenship." I mean, the set of concerns that sort of inform the book, have been percolating in my consciousness and in my brain for many, many years. In the post-Trump period, I mean, I think we're going to, political scientists are for generations going to look at the world, particularly the evolution and possible devolution of liberal democracy in a kind of pre- and post-Trump period. And that's not to lay either the blame or the credit for any of this at the feet of Trump per se. But one of the things that was occurring long before we had protests in the streets, in the wake of the death of George Floyd, we had citizens for the last 3.5 years in the United States and indeed throughout the world, increasingly asking the question, how the heck did we get here? In reference to the rise of Donald Trump, the rise of Bolsonaro, the rise of Viktor Orban, the rise of others who passed themselves off as reformers and ultimately morphed very quickly into the demagogues that they always were. How did we get here? How did this happen? And it was almost thrown out as a rhetorical question. Throw your hands in the air. How did we get here? And I responded to that question, in my own mind, with a different question. And that question was, how is it that citizens of these Western liberal democracies, so-called, could permit the assault on the fundamental institutions and core values that underpin liberal democratic society? How did the citizens let this happen? And as I began to sort of think through that question more deeply, I realized the problem essentially, first of all, the problem's complex. Let's not suggest that the answers to these questions are one-dimensional or very, very simple. They're very, very complex set of reasons for what's occurred, what I call democratic backsliding, and the response to it. But one of the sort of aspects of this that I have focused on very seriously and I'm very interested in is the nature of citizenship itself. That ultimately, it's just not good enough to blame the demagogues. It's not good enough to blame, broad trends in sort of populist politics. I mean, there are a lot of broad trends that are absolutely central. The impact of the internet and the nature of social media, and of course, the exponential increase in economic inequality year over year, both in terms of wage gaps and wealth disparities. But those, in a way, can be viewed as both causes and also symptoms. My question at the root is, how do citizens allow any of these things to occur? And one of my answers to that question has to do with and it goes back to an earlier question you asked about knowledge and expertise and education. And that is that you can't possibly have a constitutional liberal democracy without constitutional or liberal constitutional citizens. And how do you get that? They have to be educated. Citizens need to be educated into their responsibilities of citizenship, something that civics education doesn't achieve anywhere that I'm aware of. Doesn't achieve it. Our civics education focuses largely on formal political process, institutional design, and the like. So students graduate from high school knowing, something about the legislative system, something about the legal system, very broad terms, something about the fact that there are elections and that, you participate in a particular way periodically. But they know nothing about the core values of the system that they are, as citizens, required to govern, because democracy is the government of society by the governed. That's what it's supposed to mean. And the fact that we may delegate those responsibilities to representatives, and different systems, operate on, different models. But fundamentally, that's what it's about. If citizens are not educated into the role of guardians of the fundamental values that underpin liberal democracy, how in God's name could they ever be expected, first of all, to even recognize a threat to those values when it appears? And secondly, how could they possibly ever sort of be called to defend those values against the perils and the threats? So, what my view of what civics should be all about, and what really animates the book for me, is the idea that everybody, we owe it to ourselves to educate ourselves to what true civics is all about, which, if I were to sort of encapsulate it in a phrase, I would say it is the sense of duty to defend political liberty and the values of constitutional democracy. That's what civics education should be trying to do.
So all of this conversation can easily just become another set of language, terms, and ideas that, don't really come to life except in possibly a well-written civics textbook. But I'm wondering, for our listeners who may know liberal democracy as a term, what are some of those fundamental ideas that are at the core of every effective liberal democracy that we need to recognize?
Sure, I'm happy to respond to that. But before I do, let me just comment on something that you just remarked on, which is, you referred to a civic textbook.
Yes.
My view of, there's no question that a strong civics education has to certainly have a serious intellectual element to it. There's no question. But a great civics education needs to educate citizens not just to develop an intellectual understanding, right, of these concepts that we can talk about, but to actually have a visceral sense, a visceral experience of these values. So there's an element of conditioning, and I don't want to say indoctrination, because the term, engenders all kinds of sort of negative connotations. But it's a really great civics education doesn't just exist in the pages of a good civics textbook. It exists also on the experiential level, so that people coming out of high school, if that's, just for argument's sake, really need to have this sort of visceral appreciation of these values, and not just intellectual.
And if I could just jump in on that point, just to piggyback on the idea of visceral, which I understand also as emotional. So it's not just the brain, it's the head and the heart.
Yes, it is the heart. And you use the term emotional, that kind of evokes for me some of the things that, for example, Martha Nussbaum has written about. But in political emotions, and we could talk about that. There is an emotional dimension to this, but there's also a danger when you talk about political emotions, because it also, in a way, those emotions need to be, if not regulated, they need to be informed by. Now I'm going to sort of make the contra argument. They do need to be informed and checked by the intellectual side of things, the rational side, the actual, education in the concepts, the fundamental concepts, because emotion without the discipline of an education in the core values on the intellectual side, has produced, as historically very, very dangerous results. Obviously, it's easy to harken back to the Third Reich and but there's no shortage of examples of what happens when emotion becomes weaponized. And by the way, that doesn't make it any less authentic, but it's been manipulated. The point is that in a liberal democracy, and certainly Martha Nussbaum gets this, better than I do. It's got to be an educated emotion. But let's go back to your question, just so that I don't, again, I'm not accused of having avoided it. You asked about some of the elements of a liberal democracy. Liberal democracies have to have a number of basic characteristics. Just formally speaking, they've got to have a democratic electoral system. Those elections have to be periodic, fair, and meaningful. They have to guarantee basic, civil rights and civil liberties, starting with, of course, free expression, which has been referred to as sort of the paramount or foundational right or freedom, and all of the other corresponding rights: freedom of conscience, freedom of assembly, etc. They have to adhere to the rule of law. That's a very actually complex idea, what the rule of law really entails. It all has to occur inside a rules-based system, and one that is not arbitrary, and and one in which the rules themselves are not subject to manipulation by people in political power or people who are otherwise influential in society. I mean, they've got to be fair. They've got to be, they've got to be neutral. They have to be consistent, and of course, they have to have a nonpartisan, professional, and neutral civil service as well. And in my view, and we've already talked about this a little bit, is that they must have this widespread deference to the authority of facts and truth and knowledge, this shared epistemic foundation that we referred to earlier. Now, there's a whole host of other sort of characteristics of liberal democracies, and at different times. And if you ask the question, what were the requirements of liberal democracy, say in a post, John Stuart Mill period, but prior to, the Second World War, we would have stopped there. But post Second World War, we have an expanded view of what sort of the liberal bag of promises includes. It's the entire package of government, the social safety net, a richer idea of what is entailed in political freedoms such as speech and voting rights, a certain view of commercial prosperity. And the enjoyment of, the rights rather than the privileges of the rights to healthcare, education, housing, things like that. Inclusiveness. There's a whole, range of sort of ideas that go to what Lorraine Weinrib has called, the human dignity and sort of the package of promises that give expression to or recognition to a richer idea of what a human being is in society.
Peter, I'd like to ask you about some of the signals that we might watch for as citizens, some of those things that might signal erosion of a liberal democracy. But before I do that, I wanted to ask the question that I know is on a lot of people's minds. Was there ever a golden age? Has there been a golden age of liberal democracy? Was it that post-war period or some other period of history?
There was certainly a moment in time when leading political theorists, among others, declared that the golden age had arrived. I'm thinking of Francis Fukuyama famously, declaring the end of history. And that was a kind of, around 1990, the late 80s, early 90s, when the Reagan Revolution had sort of coincided with the fall of Soviet communism, and the Iron Curtain comes down, and there's this idea that liberal democratic values have now triumphed, and the war, and the great superpowers of the world, China, of course, accepted, recognizing suddenly. Although at that time, China was accepting the market aspects of the liberal democratic experiment. All right, so that one could argue that was. That would be considered the golden age. But I would say it was only, if it was a golden age, it was only a golden age in the sense that from an economic standpoint, the major promises of equality hadn't yet been absolutely shattered, which they are now, without any shadow of a doubt. There was still this sense that economic inequality, while it would naturally flow from a system of market economics, would still be sufficiently tamed by our regulatory framework such that, growth and wealth creation would be accompanied by a betterment of those at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale as well, right? That's just nobody can pretend that that's the case anymore. And of course, that was sort of at the root of Reagan's sort of trickle down economics, right, at the time as well. That very theory. But certainly, if you're looking at it from the standpoint of civil rights, there's an argument to be made that that was not a golden age. I mean, look at the progress that has been made, or, some people don't even view it as progress, but in terms of the recognition of LGBTQ rights since that period. When we were in the moment and we were in the throes of AIDS and HIV at the time, there was a sense that maybe we had accomplished most of what the human rights revolution was supposed to accomplish. And so, economically things were pretty good. It was prior to the 92 sort of recession, and the Soviet Iron Curtain had come down, and the human rights revolution had really unfolded. In Canada, of course, we'd had by that point 8 years of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So we were in a post-rights period. We were in a charter period in Canada. Now we can look at it and say, probably wasn't a golden period. It was probably a period when we were deluding ourselves. And indeed, Francis Fukuyama has since kind of recanted, right? He's recognized that his declaration was somewhat premature. That we'd reached the end of history. That there was this this moment of dialectical perfection.
But I sense that recanting is part of the dynamic that you're talking about. And I know in one of your chapters, one of your authors on freedom of expression talks about that movement, the idea that ideas come into play with each other in such a way that people can say, yeah, I was wrong, or even we were wrong.
Well, yeah, if what you're saying is that Fukuyama was, is proven that it appears to be intellectually honest, and to, but that's just, and that's right. I mean, I think you're talking about Sid Goldenberg's fantastic chapter on freedom of expression, in which, he talks about the marketplace of ideas, as do I. And, in fact, he's quite concerned that the courts in some places have actually gone a little too far in restricting and regulating speech in the interest. I mean, it's always with good intentions, right? In the interest of protecting some otherwise discrete and insular minority from harm resulting from, tough speech, hurtful speech, right? But of course, the consequence, as Sid points out, and as the Americans actually have pointed out much more enthusiastically than Canadian civil libertarians have done, it really does adversely impacts the viability of a robust marketplace of ideas. You need to have a universe of critical scrutiny where unpopular speech is protected, just in order to keep yourself honest, if for no other reason. But of course, there are other good reasons as well.
I know we could spend at least an hour talking about that marketplace concept, and I love the metaphor, and I love the idea and the way you've raised it up in the book, not only in your chapter, but it finds play in other chapters as well. But Peter, I wanted to go back to that idea of some signals because I think people listening, those signals are going to resonate. We need to give them some tools to look out and say, yeah, that's right. I see that. That's what's being threatened. And that's what's under stress. And I'm wondering, are there particular principles or features of a liberal democracy, and I think you've pointed to 5 of them, that stand out as being particularly, I guess, under more stress than others? Are there places that we can be looking that really paint a clear picture of what's really being challenged here?
They're all being challenged. And the wonderful thing about Donald Trump, by the way, and again, I don't want to sound like that's, that I live and breathe Donald Trump, but he's given he's given the world of civil libertarians and public intellectuals such a gift, because he contains in one single package all of the ills and evils. He is a one-man walking billboard for all of the things that either have gone wrong or are in the process of going wrong in liberal democracy. So what I would say is, because he's attacking every single one of the fundamental tenets of liberal democracy. I identify what I call I've called it my secular decalogue, if you will, of sort of core values. We'll have to get into them right now, but he has, he stands for the undoing of each and every one of them. I mean, you want to talk about, the importance of a democratic electoral system. Well, I mean, he's a one-person assault on the integrity of a democratic electoral system. Everything he stands for is voter suppression, inequality in representation and expression at the polling booth, lack of integrity in the democratic process in general, interference in the electoral sort of process, welcoming, of course, the intervention of friendly outsiders, that is friendly to him, in the manipulation of process, but much more importantly, of course, the manipulation of public sort of sensibility and public opinion on the questions that are that ought to be sacred to the members of the society participating in this sacred process of choosing their governments, choosing their leaders, and choosing their policies. So that's just in one place.
Isn't it fair to say, though, that he came into a system that was challenged in those areas? I mean, you look at PACs and you look at super PACs and the influence of various people in the process. He didn't invent those stressors.
He didn't invent anything. I mean, if Donald Trump, if you're listening, I hate to tell you, you didn't invent anything. So no, he didn't invent anything, as much as he would like to take credit for being the prime mover and the inventor of all kinds of things. No, every one of those things was there. Gerrymandering was there, right? The process of redistricting is another way that people, in the States refer to gerrymandering. Voter suppression in all kinds of ways was there. Election financing, which you also just essentially referred to. I mean, when you talk about PACs and super PACs, who gets to really express themselves in the democratic process? I mean, it's one thing to make your point, to make your argument, to put it in on the front page of the Globe and Mail or on your Facebook post, or to stand in front of your legislature with a sign or a placard. But political expression also occurs in the formal political process, and there's no question that election finance laws, particularly in the United States, absolutely undermine the integrity of the of a viable and fair and meaningful democratic electoral system. So you're right, absolutely. Trump didn't invent any of this stuff. Although he certainly he and his minions and advisors certainly took things to a whole other level. I mean, the 2016 election really was the first election. People always talk about Obama's first and second election as being sort of the first, real social media elections. And it's true that in those two elections, his campaign team really developed and refined, the methods of using social media and the internet broadly to mobilize your constituency. But Trump did something completely different. He's the first person, and his campaign is the first campaign to weaponize social media and to weaponize certain aspects of human nature, if you will, for dishonest purposes, and obviously with a tragic outcome. an absolutely tragic outcome.
So I'm glad you mentioned social media. And I guess I'm thinking of that second condition of liberal democracy that you pointed to, free expression. And I know that not only are many people in the States getting weary of the term fake news, I think the whole world is getting weary of the term fake news and what it's come to mean through certain lenses. What role has social media played in the eroding of our whole appreciation for free expression? It's become so polarized. Do we really know what we mean by free expression anymore?
Yeah, so very important question, obviously, and we don't have time today to go into it in depth, but there's no question that social media, I mean, first of all, we thought with the advent of the internet and the advent of social media that this would amount to the democratization of expression. The idea of citizen journalists, the idea of greater access to information and greater means of self-expression, right? And all of that in an obvious way is absolutely true. But there's a dark side to this, and it's a very, very sinister dark side. And that is that this democratization of information has actually ended up resulting in an erosion from within and manipulation from without of social media. I mean, it's the echo chamber phenomenon. All right, that ultimately results in the fragmentation of discourse, right, and the supremacy of the echo chamber as a kind of, what I've called it, a structural barrier to consensus generation across partisan and ideological lines, because ultimately, you only speak to those who are, well disposed to what you have to say. You only listen to those, who you're well disposed to listening to. And if you're running a campaign of any kind, whether in the formal political context or more broadly, and by the way, this even includes, in the marketplace, in the commercial marketplace, in the consumer marketplace, not just the marketplace of social and political ideas or other ideas, scientific ideas, for example, you end up actually mobilizing armies of citizens to a particular end in the service of a particular cause without regard to the scientific, intellectual, factual integrity of the content, all right, of what's being discussed, which is exactly what Trump's done. I mean, 10 years ago, would anyone imagine that a president could say that there is widespread, rampant voter fraud and that 3 million votes, in California, were cast by non-citizens and fraudsters? Who would have thought you could say that and not be fact-checked? Or who would even have had the gall to say it in the first place? We're now living in a universe where there is a constituency out there who are all ears for whatever, whether it's Trump or anyone else, has to say. They're prepared to accept it as the gospel truth, and they're prepared to act on it. So you've got the weaponization of disinformation. This has always existed in one form or another. I mean, Goebbels, is often credited with being the real inventor of propaganda in the modern sense. And that's obviously true, right? And there was no internet, in the 30s and 40s in Germany. But there's no question that the social media in the internet age has really amplified this problem exponentially. So that all of the problems that existed before, partisanship, which isn't in itself a bad thing, partisanship's not a bad thing, but the polarization that has resulted from this entrenched partisanship where there is no exchange of ideas, where there is no, subjecting ideas, arguments to the critical scrutiny of the other side, because the other side's completely delegitimized ab initio, right? We're living in a world where the other side's arguments don't get heard in certain quarters. Right, and this applies. I mean, I'm not just talking about the extreme right. I mean, this exists everywhere. The liberals are as guilty of these. I mean, it's not ideological in the sense that it's a function of where you stand on the ideological axis. if there is such a thing anymore.
Well, one of the rules of Lex Radio, Peter, is that you get an extra half hour if you throw in a little bit of Latin, which you did. And I think both of us would agree that these issues are going to need a lot more depth and a lot more conversation. But before we end today, I wanted to address, I'm going to frame it a little bit as a dynamic, a bit of a dance between leadership and citizenship, and in particular, that idea of the heroic citizen. What comes first in terms of where we need to place more emphasis as we move forward to, I guess, de-stress our liberal democracy? Do we need to start at the level of the heroic citizenship, or do we need to begin with leadership?
If we're talking about a democracy, you have to start with citizenship. Now, our bias, as students of history, our bias is to focus on leaders. How many history books have you read where citizens are the main protagonists? Even in the stories about revolutionary moments in history, we still focus on the leaders of the revolution. We talk about the vanguard and the leaders of the vanguard. In a democracy, you really have to talk about citizenship. I'm often, I love to talk about leadership, and I think about it, and it's absolutely critical. But leadership in a liberal democracy is much different, and I would submit much more difficult. It's a different enterprise than leadership in any other type of society. Let me give you an example. I think one of the greatest leaders in the last 100 years anywhere that I can think of is Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. I mean, just great by any measure and any standard. But he was not the leader of a democracy. He was the founder of a society. And we don't have time to talk about the history of Singapore. But it's fantastic. If we did have time, maybe in another conversation, we could talk about sort of the qualities that made him a great leader in a non-democratic country, right? He was heroic in all of the right ways. Of course, he was very authoritarian. A leader in an authoritarian system, even a benign one, must dictate, must hand down the laws, must be a teacher, and must, essentially provide the framework. In a democracy, a leader's prime responsibility is to develop and bring about consensus across partisan lines, across ideological lines, across all kinds of different sort of, differences. And he must do it, or she must do it, in a way that both offers direction and kind of shows the way, but doesn't impose. Doesn't impose because you can't impose if you're a leader. Look what happens when a leader in a democracy tries to simply impose, tries to, goes to the well of his power, such as, look at what Trump's been doing in the last couple of weeks. I have the power to do this, so I'm going to do it. I have the power to do that. Quite apart from the fact that he doesn't understand the Constitution. Even if he did, the fact is that in a democracy that just is not going to work. It may work in moments of emergency. And, it's very, very interesting. I was just rereading one of my favorite books, Leadership in Turbulent Times by Doris Kearns Goodwin. And if you haven't read it, I commend it to you. She talks about the ways in which, the great moments of, historical challenge, a war, a depression, a civil war, some major catastrophe, those moments in which a great leader or a leader becomes a great leader by rising to the moment. But, leaders don't start out in those moments, generally speaking. They start out in positions of political responsibility for any one of a number of reasons. And then, they have to meet the challenges as they arise. I mean, fundamentally, FDR probably wouldn't have been a very notable or great leader, but for the challenges that he had to face at the end of the Depression and the war. Similarly, Churchill would have been nobody had it not been for the war and the way in which he rose in that moment. But leadership is very, very complex in a liberal democracy. Very, very complex. It requires that leaders forbear from misusing their power. It's the opposite of using it. It's using it with great care. It requires that they never seek to delegitimize their opponents. In a democracy, your opponent or your adversary is not the enemy, which, of course, another rule that Trump broke, right? I mean, if you're not with him, then not only are you against him, but you're unpatriotic. That doesn't work in a democracy. So there's a set of skills that are required. Ultimately, I think a great leader does many things. One of them, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it, is that a great leader really needs to infuse her citizens with a sense of meaning and purpose. And again, this does not mean dictating to the citizenry. It means helping a citizenry actualize their own potentialities. And that requires a kind of mentorship, a kind of guidance, the ability to generate interest in a set of ideas, to bring people along, and to help them agree, even when that means to help them agree to disagree, because leadership requires a kind of harmony around agreeing on a set of policies and programs that not everyone will love, but that everyone will accept and acknowledge. So it's a very, very complex set of skills in a democracy.
Are you assuming then that if we do a really good job of citizenship education beyond the classroom, beyond the textbook, and into our communities, into our social lives, that we're going to get a different class, if you will, of leaders?
I would say absolutely yes. To me, it's axiomatic. Okay, it's axiomatic. The connection between a great civics education, which, by the way, just to be clear, is not reduced to or reducible to a civics course or even a set of civics courses. I mean, it's much broader. My concept of civics education is an ongoing kind of cultural exercise that touches and engages citizens at all stages of life as they meet the institutions throughout the course of their life. It's not simply a set of courses and classes and books that you read, from ages 10 to 18. But I think the answer to your question is absolutely yes. The connection is axiomatic. I don't see how it could be otherwise.
Well, that's a hopeful note on which to end, but we do have a lot of work to do. I love the fact that you talked about education in terms of citizenship education, the way that many of us are starting to talk about education in general. It's not about what happens in the schoolhouse as much as it is, well, as one of my science colleagues used to say, as much as it is about what happens on the way home from the schoolhouse. Well, Peter, as we've said a couple of times, still lots to talk about. I wanted to give you a chance before we end to tell us a little more about your book, some specifics. Where can we pick it up? When can we expect to have it in our hands?
I'll give you the name again. It's called Constitutional Democracy Under Stress, A Time for Heroic Citizenship. It's got contributions and it's being published by Mosaic Press, a wonderful publishing house out of Oakville, Ontario. It'll be out hopefully within the next few weeks and will be available online, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, etc., and at other booksellers. But for the pandemic, it would have been out already, but everything's been delayed. It's got contributions from a wonderful wide range of fantastic activists, experts, scholars, former Justice Minister Irwin Cotler, Tom Axworthy, former Principal Secretary to Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Nathan Vanderclip, fabulous Globe and Mail journalist writing on freedom of expression in the context of the role of journalists. Jane Goodall, of course, one of my dear friends and mentors, and I've worked with her for many years when I was running the Jane Goodall Institute. Justice Alison Harbison Young of the Ontario Court of Appeal, Leonid Sirota on the rule of law. Just a long list of wonderful people who are committed Mary Jo Letty. I'd be remiss not to mention her name. Just and a lot of these people are not only friends of mine, they're heroes of mine. And the concept of the book was not to take an academic or scholarly approach. It's not to say that there isn't a scholarly approach in some of the pieces, but it was an effort to try to address the problem of democratic backsliding and what we can do about it from the standpoint of educated citizens, rather than political theory or legal scholars, and activists who really want to engage with the world, and there are many contributions in the book from people who've really dedicated their lives to particular projects that have everything to do with making society intellectually more honest and socially more just in every possible way.
Well, that's just what I found. And you were good enough to share some of the book with me. And I found, well, it's thick, it's rich, but kind of like a good spaghetti sauce. It's accessible, and I'm really excited for people to read it. So, Peter Biro, thank you for that. And thank you for this. This has been a wonderful conversation. I feel very honored to have spent time with you today.
It's been a privilege to talk with you. A real pleasure.
Thanks for joining us for today's edition of Lex Conversations. In addition to his LinkedIn profile, you can find out more about Peter Biro by visiting section1.ca. We're hoping that some part of today's conversation got you thinking a little more deeply about the so what of the challenges that face us today. But we'd also like to invite some of your now what thinking. We need your imagination, your creativity, and your energy as we work to build a community focused on workable, scalable solutions. Sign up for the special Leaders Expedition interest group on LinkedIn to listen to more great content and to find out more about how you can become part of this energy, this community, and this work. I'm Stephen Hurley for Lex Conversations and Voice Ed Radio. This podcast series has been produced and edited using Hindenburg Broadcaster, one of the many tools that you'll find by visiting hindenburg.com. Many thanks to Hindenburg for their support of our work here at Voice Ed Radio.